I never imagined my retirement would involve filing multiple noise complaints, discovering legal loopholes, and eventually purchasing a surplus military helicopter. But after living in my house for 30 years, long before our neighborhood association turned borderline fanatical, it seemed that fate had other plans. The trouble began just over a month ago when I was reading on my porch, relishing the calm of Saturday afternoon, and noticed a shiny white BMW partially blocking my driveway. At first, I assumed it must be a visitor who confused my driveway for someone else's. Maybe they were lost or delivering a package. But hours passed, and the car didn't move. I walked out and left a polite note under the windshield wiper, asking the owner to please park more carefully. No response. By sunset, the BMW was still there, forcing me to maneuver my truck onto the curb just to exit my own property. It was inconvenient, but hardly a crisis, at least at that point. The next morning, the car was gone. I thought it was a fluke and went on with my business. That is, until the following weekend, when I spotted the same BMW angled so close to my mailbox that I nearly sprained an ankle getting the Sunday paper. I decided it was time for a civil conversation. I saw no reason for hostility or formal complaints. After all, I've had some friendly interactions with the folks in our neighborhood association, even though they're quite strict about paint colors and lawn lengths. I knocked on a few doors, eventually discovering that the BMW belonged to Karen Lockwood, also known around here as HOA Karen. She was the association's newly appointed vice president, and while she didn't technically live next door, she oversaw compliance in our section of the neighborhood. I introduced myself and explained the parking situation. She scrunched her face, scanned me up and down, and spat out something like, "Well, perhaps you should trim the hedges that obstruct clear marking of your driveway." I replied calmly, "I'd be happy to trim the hedges if it helps, but in the meantime, I'd appreciate if you wouldn't block my driveway." She retorted, "According to HOA regulations, any unsightly or overgrown vegetation is subject to a fine, and those hedges look borderline to me." Then, just when I thought she was going to promise to park properly, she shook her head dismissively. "Besides," she added, "my car tires aren't exactly on your driveway. They're on the street. If you can't navigate around that, maybe you shouldn't be driving." I was too stunned by her tone to say much else, so I simply thanked her for her time and returned home. The following weekend, I found that her BMW was now intentionally parked dead center in front of my driveway, as if making some twisted point. I had to swing my truck around at a ridiculous angle just to get out, nearly clipping my hedges, which were hardly overgrown at all. My frustration grew. As a retiree, I have all the time in the world for gardening, reading, or hooking up my little fishing boat for a trip to the lake. But I do not have patience for petty power plays. Still, I try to be the adult in the room. I wrote an official letter to the HOA, politely noting the consistent blocking of my driveway by Karen's car. Within a week, I received a response from the association's secretary, acknowledging my letter, but dismissing it with vague references to insufficient evidence and gray areas of public street parking. They did, however, offer me a pamphlet on HOA-approved landscape and driving etiquette. If I didn't know better, I have suspected some of Karen's language in that pamphlet matched exactly what she told me in person, about how we're all responsible for ensuring there's enough room on the street. Once I realized the HOA was going to be of no help at all, I tried calling the city's code enforcement office. They cited some local ordinance about leaving at least 3 feet of clearance in front of residential driveways. Technically, Karen's front tires usually left around 3 feet. Barely. And because my driveway is a bit narrower than most, and my truck is relatively large, the city official explained that her car's presence, while rude, wasn't exactly illegal. It was in the dreaded gray area that nobody wanted to handle. The next Sunday, I was sitting in my sunroom, peering through the curtains at that gleaming BMW perched inches away from my driveway, thinking, is there any recourse left at all? That's when a mail arrived, with yet another notice from the HOA. This time, they were threatening to fine me if I didn't replace my garage door, which they deemed faded. My garage door was nearly new, painted a tasteful beige that matched my house. But the association had decided they had unanimous agreement it needed to be replaced. I flipped through their pictures and realized how petty they were being. The difference between my garage door and the approved shade was maybe a fraction of a hue. It became crystal clear. Karen had set her sights on me. When Karen sets her sights on anyone, the entire might of the HOA machine apparently backs her up. And while I'd typically just grit my teeth and do the minimum necessary to comply, I felt I was facing a personal vendetta. Who does that over a hedge in a driveway? I felt the simmer of anger inside me. I wish I could say I thought of a grand plan right then and there, but the idea of obtaining a helicopter, a real, functional ex-military aircraft, didn't come to me for another 2 weeks. If I'd known the comedic chaos that was about to unfold, I might have set up a camera and documented every step of the journey. Because the moment I discovered that I could legally park a decommissioned helicopter on my property was the moment everything changed. Little did Karen know, she was about to trigger the biggest act of suburban retaliation this neighborhood had ever witnessed. And with retirement, I had enough time and money saved that I could execute it with style. It was a scalding Tuesday afternoon when destiny struck. I had driven out to a neighboring town to pick up a custom gate latch I'd ordered from a local metalworker. As I passed by the industrial park on the outskirts, a garish sign caught my eye. Military surplus auction this Saturday, with a giant photo of a tank and a helicopter emblazoned below. My first thought was that's the kind of thing my buddy Dale would drag me to. Dale's a Vietnam veteran with a penchant for collecting antique military gear, helmets, canteens, radio sets. But actual vehicles? That seemed borderline ridiculous. And yet, something compelled me to take a closer look. I parked and ambled over to a smaller poster on the fence, which read, "Bid on vehicles, tools, tents, and more. Obtain a piece of history." My eyes were drawn to the helicopter silhouette. Suddenly, a half-formed scheme fluttered through my brain. If I can't rely on the HOA or the city to keep my driveway clear, maybe I can buy something that'll make them keep it clear. It sounded absurd, even childish. But in the face of Karen's relentless harassment, it also sounded perfect. I headed home and did some furious internet research. Turns out, it is entirely possible, albeit complicated, to buy a decommissioned helicopter. If it's officially de-armed, you can own it as a private citizen. Of course, it'd require a ton of paperwork, but I figured if I could jump through the HOA's flaming hoops, I could figure out the FAA's. I called Dale to fill him in on the details. At first, he guffawed. "You're going to buy a Huey or a Black Hawk to park in your yard. Have you been sipping your own paint thinner, buddy?" But the more I explained my predicament, the more he softened to the idea. You know, he said, if the helicopter's not operational for flight, it might be just like owning a large vehicle. They can't restrict you from parking a vehicle on your property, right? That question led me deep into the labyrinth of HOA bylaws. I discovered something delightfully ironic. A few years ago, the association had tried to restrict boat parking, RV parking, and large commercial vehicles in driveways or on the street. But the measure narrowly failed because too many people in our area own small fishing boats or pop-up campers. So the official parking restrictions remained surprisingly lenient. There was nothing specifically banning helicopters. The bylaws only mentioned standard vehicles and watercraft, referencing local ordinances for anything beyond that. But again, if the helicopter was decommissioned and insured as a private vehicle, I might be in the clear. I decided to attend the Saturday auction. The parking lot was full of curious onlookers, history buffs, and the occasional reseller hoping to snag an obscure artifact. 3 battered helicopters were lined up in a row, each with fading military insignias and paint chipped from tail to rotor. One was in such rough shape that it would take thousands of dollars to even get it presentable. Busted windows, missing seats, rust along the underside. Another was relatively intact, but had severe engine issues, according to the whispering staff mechanic. Then there was the third, a Vietnam H-1 Iroquois, commonly called a Huey. It had a worn interior, but the outside was in surprisingly good shape. When the auctioneers started rattling off numbers, I felt my heart pound. The bids for the first helicopter shot up, apparently because it had more salvageable parts. The second one garnered a bidding war among a few local enthusiasts. By the time they got to the Huey, interest had waned. People had spent their budgets on the first 2, or They wanted a fully restorable flight machine. But I didn't need to fly. I just needed a statement piece. Something big. Something loud. Something that would overshadow Karen's precious BMW like a T-Rex looming over a poodle. I held up my paddle and joined the bidding. My heart hammered in my chest as the numbers rose. I'd never spent this kind of money on a toy before. I justified it by reminding myself I could use some of my retirement nest egg for a bit of mischief, especially if it helped me preserve my sanity in the face of constant HOA harassment. The tension built, but eventually the gavel slammed, and I was the proud, if slightly dumbfounded, owner of a genuine, decommissioned Huey helicopter. Securing the Huey meant more paperwork than I could have imagined. Transferring ownership, verifying the demilitarization certificates, and ensuring no hidden ordnance was lurking in compartments. The staff made me sign countless disclaimers. Honestly, it felt like adopting a giant metal dinosaur. But once the dust settled, I walked away with the keys, though keys is a loose term here. There was no functional ignition anymore, a stack of documents, and a plan forming in my mind. Over the next few days, I arranged transportation to get that beast onto my property. Flatbed trucks, crane rentals, and some thoroughly amused contractors were involved. The cost alone might have made a lesser man back out, but I was past the point of no return. With every signature and phone call, I pictured the look on Karen's face when she realized I was about to park a helicopter, legally, right in my driveway. I took to humming the Ride of the Valkyries whenever I thought about it. Dale teased me for my macho revenge fantasy, but he was also curious as to how this all might shake out. As the weekend approached, I double-checked the HOA rules. There was still no mention of rotor blades. No mention of prohibited aerial vehicles. I even had a local attorney friend give the bylaws a once-over. She giggled at the sheer absurdity of it all, but confirmed that the HOA had no standing rule that could prevent me from parking a big chunk of metal labeled as a private vehicle. The only potential threat was a noise ordinance if I tried to start the engine, which I had no intention of doing. I was giddy and a little anxious. This was, after all, one of the wildest stunts I'd ever pulled. But somewhere in my gut, I knew that if I caved to Karen's intimidation, life in this neighborhood would become intolerable. Sometimes you have to stand up for yourself in a memorable way. And if that memorable way happened to be an iconic piece of American military history, so be it. Moving day for the helicopter felt like a covert military operation, albeit one with coffee-sipping crane operators and a beer-gutted driver who kept making jokes about Top Gun. The 18-wheeler hauling the Huey rolled onto my street mid-morning, drawing curious neighbors out of their houses. Some folks, I suspected, might have come out because of the commotion alone. Others probably got wind, no pun intended, that something big was coming. I saw curtains twitch and phones raised to snap photos. Normally, our neighborhood is the epitome of suburban tranquility, neat lawns, pastel paint jobs, polite ways at the mailbox. But not that day. That day, it looked like a Hollywood set, with an enormous machine strapped to a flatbed, a crane ready to hoist it off, and men in high-visibility vests shouting instructions over radio static. And there I stood, in my pressed khakis and a baseball cap, trying not to look as thrilled as a kid at Disneyland. Karen was nowhere in sight at first, though I had little doubt she'd appear eventually. The rumble of the truck's engine was impossible to ignore, and I suspected she was watching from behind her pristine Venetian blinds. Our first real complication came when the crane operator announced he needed extra clearance from the street to my driveway. The helicopter was heavy, and the crane's angle would require part of the road to be cordoned off. We placed orange cones and caution tape around the operation. Naturally, this blocked a few parking spots along the curb, namely the one that Karen's BMW usually occupied. It took a solid hour to maneuver the crane, calibrate the lift, and get the helicopter suspended over my front lawn. I held my breath as it swung gently above my shrubs, praying it wouldn't drop and crush my wife's rose bushes. Eventually, it settled onto the driveway with a whoosh that rattled my windows. The crane operator gave a thumbs up. I grinned and returned the gesture. Mission accomplished, at least from a logistical standpoint. The chatter among the neighbors was immediate. Is he actually going to keep that there? What's the association going to say? Where did he even get that thing? Then came the one voice I was expecting dreaded, and, if I'm honest, secretly itching to hear. Excuse me, excuse me. It was Karen, marching up in a crisp blouse and pressed slacks, as if she'd just come from some board meeting. Her eyes were locked on the helicopter, wide with incredulity. What on earth is this? She snapped, pointing at the Huey like it was a rabid dog. I forced my most neighborly smile. Hi, Karen. This is my new vehicle. I trust the crane didn't inconvenience you too much. She looked at me like I'd announced my intention to run for president. Vehicle? It's a helicopter, for goodness sake, she exclaimed, voice tight with outrage. That's correct, I replied, flipping through my paperwork for the relevant documents. It's fully decommissioned, demilitarized. According to federal and local guidelines, it's no longer considered an aircraft for operation. Essentially, it's a private collector's vehicle. She sputtered. You can't park a helicopter in this neighborhood. There has to be a rule against it. She whipped out her phone, presumably to contact the HOA's legal team or maybe the police. I waved my own copies of the bylaws under her nose, pointing to the sections on parking regulations, which only mentioned vehicles and had absolutely zero reference to non-operational aircraft. That's not the spirit of the rules, she insisted, face flushing red. I'll have the president review this. This is an eyesore. It's unacceptable. Her free hand gestured wildly at the Huey's tail, which was currently overshadowing my hedge. I could practically see her mind churning with ways to spin this into a violation. Maybe it was too tall, or extended beyond the property line, or required a special permit. Actually, I said calmly, the tail is fully within my property boundaries, and the rotor blades have been removed. I also had the local building inspector verify it wouldn't pose a hazard or block any sidewalks. Not to mention, it's no louder than a standard vehicle when it's not running. And I have zero plans to start it. You're insane, she muttered. I'll have you fined. I'll have that monstrosity towed. By all means, I said, reach out to a tow company and see if they can haul off a 5-ton helicopter from private property without a court order. Her glare could have melted steel. She spun around and marched back down the street. Phone pressed her ear. I could almost see cartoon steam billowing from her ears. A few neighbors who'd been rubbernecking gave me supportive nods, or in some cases, wide-eyed stares of disbelief. One even whispered, "You've got guts, man," before slipping away. I gazed at my new driveway occupant. It felt surreal, like I just placed a giant mechanical statue in front of my home. My lawnmower looked downright puny next to it. Part of me wondered if I'd gone too far. But that worry was drowned out by the sheer satisfaction of leveling the playing field. Karen's intimidation tactics had met their match. I spent the rest of the day cleaning and detailing the Huey, wiping away grime and giving the interior a gentle vacuuming. It was more symbolic than anything. I had no illusions about making it pristine, but there was something cathartic about taking care of it, treating it like a cherished old car. I even hung a small air freshener from one of the overhead supports, for comedy's sake. That night, I was too amped up to sleep right away. I sat in my living room, sipping tea, hearing the faint hum of conversation from neighbors who were still gossiping about my helicopter in hushed tones. I knew that Karen would spend the next few days, and maybe nights, trying to figure out how to sabotage my big statement. But I also knew I had the law and the lack of specific HOA rules on my side. As I finally headed to bed, I felt a sense of accomplishment. If the HOA wanted a war, they'd get one. I just hoped they were ready to stand toe-to-toe with a retired widower who discovered a taste for comedic vengeance. 3 days later, I got the first formal notice from the HOA's Compliance and Standards Committee. The letter was filled with official-sounding jargon, claiming that my helicopter was in violation of community aesthetics and thus subject to immediate removal or daily fines. They cited some newly minted rule about oversized mechanical installations. Of course, I suspected Karen had railroaded that rule through an emergency session. But the letter neglected one crucial detail: an effective date. New rules typically can't be applied retroactively. In response, I penned a concise letter of my own, pointing out that I had parked the Huey prior to the new rules adoption, making it effectively grandfathered in. Additionally, I reminded them that local ordinances classified my property as my own domain for any non-operational vehicle. I ended the letter with a polite invitation for them to bring the matter to small claims court if they really thought they could force me to remove it. The next day, Karen showed up on my doorstep with two other HOA board members, a man in a sharp suit and a woman who looked perpetually anxious, wringing her hands. I invited them inside, offered coffee, and they declined stiffly. Instead, they shoved a thick file of paperwork onto my kitchen island, gesturing at various highlighted paragraphs. The man in the suit introduced himself as the HOA's legal consultant. He launched into a spiel about how the new rule clearly stated that any item or vehicle exceeding certain height or length measurements must not be visible from the street. I patiently explained that the rule was not in effect when I placed the helicopter, and laws typically don't work backward. He then tried another tack. "This is a nuisance, sir, and the board has discretion to determine nuisances. We've had multiple complaints from neighbors." I glanced at the anxious woman. Multiple complaints? She averted her gaze. I knew many of my neighbors were actually more amused than upset, though perhaps some were annoyed by all the attention our street was getting. "Well, I'd be happy to address legitimate nuisance issues," I said, such as noise or safety hazards. "But as you can see, it's silent and it's locked. No one can climb in without permission." Karen tapped her foot. "We can't have that eyesore remain. It's humiliating for the entire neighborhood. Do you really want to drive down property values for everyone here?" Her words were tinged with desperation. Maybe she feared looking incompetent or losing control. The man in the suit cleared his throat. "If you remove the helicopter voluntarily, the board is willing to waive any fines or legal fees that have been accrued. Fines that I haven't agreed to or acknowledged," I countered, "and that my lawyer says are unenforceable under the current bylaws." Karen's face turned sour. "So you plan to keep that monstrosity forever?" I shrugged. "Until I get bored. Or until you and the HOA stop treating my driveway like it's your personal vendetta zone. I just want the right to come and go from my own property without some BMW in the way. You back off, I'll consider doing the same." Her eyes flicked between me and the man in the suit. There was a silent standoff. The anxious woman finally broke in, almost pleading. "Could we compromise? Maybe we could designate a special parking spot further down for Ms. Lockwood, and you could at least move the helicopter behind a fence if that's possible." Part of me was tempted by the compromise. I wasn't out to make neighbors miserable, but at the same time, I wasn't about to let the HOA strong-arm me after the months of petty harassment. "I'll consider some aesthetic improvements," I said, "like erecting a privacy fence along one side. But the Huey stays in the driveway until Karen acknowledges that what she did was intrusive and unnecessary." Karen's jaw clenched. "I'm not apologizing for enforcing community standards," she spat. "You weren't enforcing. You were blocking. And I wrote you letters about it, which you and the board ignored." The man in the suit sighed. I could see in his eyes he recognized that Karen's personal vendetta had escalated beyond standard policy. "Let's step outside, see if there's a practical solution," he said wearily. So we did. We circled around the helicopter, Karen still livid, her face practically matching the rust on the Huey's underside. The anxious woman made a remark about how maybe if the helicopter were repainted to match the house, it'd be less of an issue. I suppressed a laugh, imagining the Huey in a dull beige. A few neighbors gathered at a distance, watching this scene unfold like it was live theater. Eventually, the man in the suit pulled Karen aside, and I saw them whisper in heated tones. He seemed to be trying to reason with her, while she gestured angrily at my house, then at the helicopter. Finally, they returned, and he spoke up. "All right, we'll put a temporary hold on enforcement. We ask that you, in good faith, keep the helicopter as inconspicuous as possible. Don't blare sirens or anything to disturb the peace. In return, the HOA will not levy fines or attempt removal until we can hold a full board meeting next month." I agreed. I had no reason to draw more attention to myself. As they turned to leave, Karen glared at me. "This isn't over," she hissed. She was right. It wasn't. But over the following weeks, with the new rules stuck in a bureaucratic tangle, the HOA found themselves unable to forcibly remove my vehicle. And a fascinating side effect emerged. The blocked driveway problem vanished. Karen no longer parked anywhere near my property. In fact, she scarcely drove down my side of the street at all. The neighbors who once frowned at any hint of nonconformity seemed to get a weird kick out of the whole spectacle. Some even snuck over to snap selfies with the helicopter, joking about the best lawn ornament in town. As time went on, the furor died down. Karen continued her crusade in smaller ways, distributing flyers about maintaining neighborhood decorum and sending out extra compliance reminders about garbage placement. But it appeared she'd lost a lot of credibility after the helicopter fiasco. People rolled their eyes when her name came up, remembering how the war she'd waged ended in a stalemate, overshadowed, literally, by my big metal beast. Eventually, the HOA meeting arrived. They voted on a revised bylaw that would ban any non-standard motorized vehicle over 7 feet in height from the driveway. But it failed by a slim margin, thanks in part to neighbors who felt the board had gone too far. One older resident told me that he'd lived in the neighborhood longer than Karen had been alive, and he was tired of her holier-than-thou nonsense. And so, the Huey stayed. Months later, I remained the proud owner of a parked, albeit inoperable, military helicopter. It's become something of a local legend. Kids ask their parents if they can see the Army chopper house, out-of-towners slow down a gawk, and I've even been asked if I'd consider renting it out for a movie prop. I politely declined. The real victory, though, is that my driveway stays clear. Karen's BMW has never once reappeared in front of my house. And the HOA? They've gone back to policing mailbox colors and lawn sprinklers, seemingly content to leave me alone. It's a bizarre truce, but one I'm more than happy to maintain. Sometimes, life throws you a bully with a clipboard and a sense of self-importance. When that happens, you can either roll over and give in, or you can roll out the big guns, or in my case, the big rotor blades. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but from my vantage point, it's best served with a dash of humor and a side of stubborn determination. The day Karen first blocked my driveway was the day she set this chain of events in motion. And while my route to a solution was unconventional, I wouldn't trade the priceless satisfaction of seeing her reaction for anything in the world. And that, dear reader, is how a feud with an entitled HOA busybody turned me into the only retiree on the block who can claim a decommissioned military helicopter as part of his suburban decor. For better or worse, it sure beats potted geraniums. The end.